and welcome to Policing TV and this edition of Talking Crime with me, Danny Shaw. Today we're talking about law enforcement and reconciliation, and our discussion is on the back of a major report from Cumberland Lodge. That's a charity that aims to empower people through open dialogue and debate to tackle the causes and effects of social division. I took part in one of the events which laid the groundwork for that report. The report focuses on past harms and past injustices and concludes that there must be alternative systems of remedy, such as restorative justice and an independent public advocate to provide support to those affected, as well as a duty of candour for serving and retired police officers, as well as public bodies. Well, I'm delighted to say that I've been joined in this discussion by the Right Reverend James Jones, the former Bishop of Liverpool, who led the Hillsborough independent panel which paved the way for fresh inquests into the disaster in 1989. And I'm also joined by Detective Superintendent Paula Bickerdike of West Yorkshire Police, who has been a key figure in this area and has served with the police, I think, for 16 years. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining me on this discussion. If I can ask you, first of all, Reverend James Jones, why do you think it's so important that there should be a duty of candour, and what difference would that make?
I think trust lies at the heart of everything. And in my experience as chairing the Hillsborough Independent Panel, I know that for decades, the families tried to access all the documents related to the investigation into the deaths of their loved ones, the 96, now the 97. And at every stage, they found themselves frustrated in this task. And I was surprised to learn that the police records are not, in fact, covered by the Public Records Act, and that actually a chief constable, if he or she so wished, could destroy any documents with impunity. And I think in order to restore trust in the police, there ought to be a duty of candour on the police to share those relevant documents that are relevant to how loved ones have died.
I think there was a proposal to tack this on to the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which is winding its way through Parliament at the moment, but I have a feeling the Home Office has rejected that. Is that your understanding?
Well, I'm in discussions with the Home Secretary at the moment in terms of responding to a report which Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, asked me to write, because after the Hillsborough Independent Panel report, she said, would I meet again with the families and could we learn lessons from how they were treated so that these things wouldn't be repeated? And she specifically said that she wanted the perspective of the families not to be lost. And the title of that report was The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. And this is indeed what the families and survivors felt that they had endured really for nearly 3 decades. And there are 25 points of learning in this report, and there are 3 principal ones, and we are looking to the government, now that the trials are all over, to respond to these 3 particular points of learning.
One of them being a duty of candour.
One of them is a duty of candour. The other is that there should be, at a contested inquest, equality of arms. In other words, at the moment, when a family goes to the inquest of a loved one who's died in the hands of the state, be it the police or a hospital trust, they come to the court legally defenseless unless they have a lot of money to pay for their own legal support. Whereas the state agency appears at the court often with some of the very best barristers and lawyers, all paid for by the public purse. And so there is an inequality of arms. There's an unlevel playing field. And it seems to me an affront to natural justice that the families who are grieving should be there legally defenseless, whereas the state agency is lawyered up. And so what we're asking for is that at those 20% of cases which are contested, the families should be supported by the public purse as well.
Well, let's wait and see if the Home Office finally comes up with the answers to the recommendations that you'd like to see. Certainly been a long wait for a response. Paula Bickerdike, in terms of duty of candour, you work with police officers all the time. Do you think it will make a difference? If so, what sort of difference would it make?
I think we started off down this route in policing with the instigation of the Code of Ethics, and I think that set out quite clearly how officers should behave and hold, importantly, other officers and staff to account in our day-to-day working lives. But whilst the Code of Ethics can be linked to misconduct and gross misconduct proceedings, I don't think anybody is suggesting that that's the importance of the duty of candour, that actually the duty of candour is something different, that what it gives is a trust for members of the public in the police to ensure that what is being disclosed to them is everything that there is to disclose, unless there is some reason that overrides that, that you can be assured that that would put the legal duty on the police to disclose everything that they have. And I think that would go some way in encouraging faith in the police and in the justice system for families in cases such as Hillsborough. But I think there's a wider issue at play, and it is about the culture in the police and the culture in public bodies. So the duty of candour has existed, for example, in the health service and social care service for some time, and is still treated with some suspicion by members of staff within those organisations who still sometimes fear the duty of candour. And for whistleblowers, often the stakes are seen as really high, of being honest about practice within certain organisations. So there is something there, even in organisations that have the legal duty, that makes it seemingly uncomfortable for people to be truly honest and to speak up when errors are committed and when mistakes are made. So whilst I do support the idea of a duty of candour, I think we need to have the changes, the long-term changes in culture that are so prevalent in the media at the moment, talking about changes in policing in culture, that would support the duty of candour, so that whilst you would have a legal obligation on an officer or staff member, retired or otherwise, to act with candour, you want them to want to act with candour in the first place, and not purely because there's a legal duty on them, because actually that's when you really get into the heart of the problem, as to creating learning cultures rather than cultures where people fear speaking up, which isn't the case in all police organisations. It isn't the case in all police teams. I don't want to create an overly negative picture, but there is still definitely, for most public sector organisations, that barrier to open and honest dialogue sometimes.
I agree very much with Paula about changing the culture, and one of the other principal recommendations of that patronising disposition report was to introduce a charter for those bereaved through public tragedy. And the agencies would sign up to this charter and promise that when it came to reviewing the tragedy, the investigation into what went wrong, there would be a duty on those agencies to put the needs, the interest and the rights of the bereaved ahead of protecting their own reputation. It's quite natural in an organisation, an institution, for people to seek to protect themselves. But when it comes to investigating a major public tragedy, I think right at the centre of it has to be those needs, rights and of those who've been most affected, the survivors and the victims.
Just to update you on what the Home Office is saying about the duty of candour, a press release from the Home Office said that the Home Secretary will be opposing amendments to establish a duty of candour on the police workforce, and it says the government has already introduced a statutory duty of cooperation for serving police officers as part of wider integrity reforms. This existing duty to cooperate puts a greater onus on officers than the duty of candour provided for in an amendment in the House of Lords, as they could ultimately be dismissed for a breach. So the government is reluctant to dilute the existing measures in place to compel officers to cooperate. So it sounds like they're not going to take you up on that recommendation. Just in terms of equality of arms, there have been some sort of reforms around that issue, particularly in relation to inquests, but it is still the case, isn't it, that someone who is bereaved and there is an inquest will still have to sort of prove that they have the right through, because they don't have the means to have representation. That sometimes can sit uncomfortably, can't it, with lawyers on the other side who are paid for by the state?
Who are you asking that question of?
Both of you.
Well, after Paula.
Yes, I think it does. And I think when we talk in the report about what independent advocacy could do for people, that feeds into the consideration of that role, and for people to have independent support. And I would see that as a gateway for being able to provide that equality of arms, albeit you would have to be funded. But I think that is where you would want to see that type of advice and gateway going through, because at the moment for families, often the only gateway is through the police, because that actually seems like the natural place to enter, the entry point at which a member of the public, a bereaved or a victim or a survivor, finds themselves engaging in these processes. And for some people, that's an uncomfortable starting point, because actually the police may be the parties who they personally feel are responsible for what's happened to their loved one or to themselves in the first place, or they may feel have some culpability or failings within that. So taking out the police as the gatekeepers for access to support would probably, for me, for larger cases like that or specific cases, would be a starting point. But absolutely they should have equality of arms. For me, I think it's very important. I've sat at inquests much lower level than the Bishop's referring to, individual deaths of family members, where bereaved relatives have found themselves in a courtroom in front of a coroner with senior police officers. And it's a very confusing, very difficult and very heart-wrenching experience for them. And those are in circumstances when actually we're not talking about culpability and responsibility. We're talking about just purely how did my loved one come to die. So I can only imagine the difficulty and the strength it must take to go through that process without those support mechanisms in place. And I would include legal advice within those support mechanisms. It means it just must be almost impossible to do.
Bishop? Yeah.
Well, adding to that, I think it's important in terms of the level playing field and the equality of arms, that the state agency is not allowed to spend more on their legal services than the family is allowed to by the public purse. But I'd like to go back to your earlier point on the press release that's come from the Home Office. Or was that today that press release has come out?
That came out a week or so ago, because the bill, I think, is about to come back to the House of Commons, I think, in the next week or so.
Well, I have to say that I've not been informed that is the government's response, and I'm surprised at that, because I've been in close contact with the Home Office on these principal recommendations from the Hillsborough report, and I would have to study the small print of the difference between duty of candour and the duty of cooperation before really commenting on that. Okay.
One thing I wanted to talk about, we talk a lot about the system, don't we? But there are also other remedies sort of outside the system. There's also something that people are seeking, because the criminal justice system, when you enter it, whether it's inquests or whether it's prosecutions, I think is so difficult for people who have been caught up in historical injustices. Bishop, I mean, you've had huge experience dealing with the Hillsborough disaster and leading that panel. What do people who've been bereaved, what do they want at the end of it? Do they want to see someone in the dock, or do they want something different, or is there a mix?
Well, what they don't want, which is a word that's imputed to them all the time, is a thing called closure, because there can be no closure to the love that you have for someone who has died and who's died tragically. What they're looking for is that the truth should be told about how their loved one died. And that's all the more important if the media and other agencies have fed into the media untruths about how their loved one died. So truth is at the heart of it, and accountability, that somebody should accept the responsibility for what has happened. And it's that truth and accountability that lies at the heart of them wanting justice for the 96, for the 97. They're not after vengeance. My experience of being with the Hillsborough families, and of course they must speak for themselves, is that they were immensely dignified, restrained, patient, and that they were motivated by honouring the love of their loved one. That's what is behind it. But having the truth told is very important to bereaved families. And one of the points that I've made elsewhere is that grief is a journey without destination. There are milestones along the way, and finding out how and why your loved one died is one of those important milestones.
Paula Bickerdike, the victims and relatives of people who've died, who you had contact with, is that the case, that they don't want closure because they can't have closure, they just want the truth to be told? Or do they also want people who are responsible for what's happened to be put in the dock, brought to justice, imprisoned?
I think it's a very individual response, and that is the issue really with the approach we have at the moment, which puts you into a process, and then you almost become dragged along with the process, and your autonomy is lost along the way for individual family members sometimes. So I think it's throughout the entire process, which people can walk into a door and then be caught up in a process that is ongoing for years. And I think sometimes people forget to keep asking what it is that those family members want, and what would be a good resolution or ending to that process, if there can ever be one for those individuals. Again, I come back to support and advocacy for families that sits outside of the criminal justice system. So we have IDVAs for independent domestic violence advisors and independent sexual violence offenders that work very nicely alongside the police and other agencies to support victims and survivors of certain offences. And we did talk at the conference about the possibility of a parallel type role, some sort of independent support for people to take them through this process and to help them advocate for what it is that they want and ensure that their voices are heard. And I think that's it. I don't think you can ever come up with a one-size-fits-all system, because it never will.
Do you think there's enough understanding and recognition that people want different things from the process? And even if the case is being taken on, let's say, by the police and the CPS, because it's a terrible offence that's happened, that the victim may not want to go along with it for reasons that are understandable. Is there enough sort of a sense of that, do you think, understanding of people's different responses?
I wouldn't say so. And I would say there that therein perhaps lies the problem of it being sitting squarely within the criminal justice system, because that is set up to provide one type of response, is it not? And whilst we do a lot more than that within the criminal justice system, we do, we could talk about all kinds of, restorative justice that we work with, although not probably to the extent that we would always like to, and other avenues. Essentially, it is set up to do one thing, is a traditional criminal justice system. So I think it's about broadening out the options, and if we broaden out the options and the response, then we would naturally fall more into considering what it is that people want within a wider system or systems.
Bishop James Jones, what are the other options if the criminal justice system is, you know, is a system that's inappropriate for some people and not what's required? What are the other options? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I think independent panels have something very special to offer. Sadly, in the criminal justice system and also in the process of public inquiries, the very people who should be benefiting from it are the ones who are alienated by the process. And victims and families and the bereaved survivors can actually feel marginalized and even further traumatized by those processes. And what I found in my work with various independent panels is that those survivors, the bereaved, the families, the relatives, were saying to me things like, you know, this is the first time that anybody's ever taken us seriously. Well, this is the first time that we've ever really been listened to. And frankly, my own conclusion through the work that I've been asked to do is that we need to review the 2005 Inquiries Act, and we need to learn lessons from what has happened through independent panels so that the victim can be put at the heart of the process and not, as it were, marginalized to the side.
So that's the next piece of work that needs to happen. There needs to be some sort of inquiry into inquiries and panels to try and get some.
Absolutely. I mean, along with the independent public advocate, I think that there is a place now for reviewing those processes of investigation. I think there is a place for appointing a commissioner for public inquiry. So, you know, for example, in the infected blood inquiry, I mean, I was involved at one stage where the families discovered that the public inquiry was to be sponsored by the Department of Health and Social Care. Well, the families had very fundamental questions to ask about how the department itself had conducted itself with the infected blood scandal. And they wanted the sponsorship to be removed from the department. And they fought very hard for this, and it was resisted. But eventually, Theresa May agreed, and it was transferred to the Cabinet Office. So I think there are lots of issues to do with public inquiries and independent panels that need to be thought through in a fresh way.
Finally, if I can ask both of you for a final thought, I'm sure you've both learned a huge amount over the past 10, 15 years, perhaps when you sort of embarked on this kind of work. Can I ask you for the sort of the main point, the main thing that you think that you have learned through working with people and for people who've experienced loss or trauma, you know, particularly with historical injustices? Bishop, first of all.
Trust. We need to recover trust in our public officials and in our public institutions who often patronize people when they come with very simple questions with a good conscience and good intentions. And as for the police, whose work I admire because I think they have huge challenges, but it was 60 years ago that we had a Royal Commission on policing. And I think 60 years on, there is now a need for a new Royal Commission on policing because the criminal landscape has changed dramatically over the last 60 years. And we need to ask whether we've got a police service really fit for the 21st century and for some of those very complex criminal issues which face us as a society.
Paula, final thought from you, please.
I think it's around so the linked points of humanity to to building trust is humanity, and remembering our humanity both as individuals and organisations. Policing is very fast-paced. It is, as the Bishop's just said, constantly evolving and changing at an unprecedented pace, not just over years, but on a day-to-day basis. So within the busyness of police work, I think it's the key is really remembering our humanity, as one of the recommendations said in the Cumberland Lodge report. And it sounds so basic, doesn't it? Say, remember that you are dealing with human beings who come with their own needs, expectations, worries, concerns, and are perhaps and usually very overwhelmed by the process that they're about to embark upon, as well as actually probably having no real cognizance of what's about to happen in their own lives and the process they're going to go through. So remembering that at every stage for victims and survivors and for relatives, I think is really a key to treating people decently within the criminal justice system.
Paula Bickerdike, Right Reverend James Jones, thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining me on this discussion. I'm sure, in fact, that we will return to these points in the future. But from this edition of Talking Crime, thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.